Mahabharata and Karma. There are some stories associated with the Mahabharata which seem to imply that the law of karma is an eye for an eye type of justice. Doesn't this contradict what we had learnt in the last video? Hello everyone, I am Pulkit Mathur, founder of The Spiritual Bee, a blog on Vedantic spirituality, and in this video we are going to address this most interesting question left by a viewer in the comments after watching the last video on karma. So if you recall, in our last video we discussed that the law of karma is not a tit-for-tat type of revengeful justice. This is because there is a divine intelligence, the intelligence of our soul, which guides the law of karma, and this intelligence scrutinizes the will and intention with which we perform each and every action and only then decides upon an appropriate karmic response. Now, in issuing a karmic response, the aim of the soul is not to reward or punish us for our actions, but to clear away the scum of the ego covering our minds so that we can realize our true self, our infinite divine swaroop in samadhi or moksha. However, this great Vedantic truth about the law of karma nevertheless appears contradicted whenever we hear certain stories related to our ancient texts such as the Mahabharata, which seem to imply that the law of karma is an eye for an eye type of unintelligent and petty justice. For example, there is a legend associated with the Mahabharata where after the great Mahabharata War, the victors, who included the 5 Pandava brothers and Sri Krishna, go to meet the parents of their cousins, the 100 Kaurava brothers whom they had killed in the war. Overcome with grief, the mother of the 100 dead brothers, Queen Gandhari, asked Sri Krishna, "Why did you have to kill my 100 sons?" To which Sri Krishna apparently replied, "I did not kill your sons, O Queen, but your sons died as a result of your own past karma. In an earlier life, you had boiled some rice and had thrown the residual hot water on the ground. As a result of this action, 100 eggs of an innocent insect perished. Therefore, as a consequence of this past action, in this life you had to suffer the loss of 100 sons." Now, to anyone hearing this story, the law of karma will certainly appear to be an eye for an eye type of cruel justice mechanism whose sole preoccupation is to keep the account of deeds mathematically balanced. Since the queen killed 100 unborn children of an insect, therefore she too must lose a mathematically exact 100 children of her own as karmic punishment. The fact that she happened to kill the baby insects accidentally and not on purpose does not factor into the karmic equation at all and does nothing to lessen her punishment. The merciless and bloodthirsty law of karma is only satisfied when the queen loses exactly 100 children of her own in some other lifespan. In fact, a few other ancient legends in a similar vein can also be found which offer karmic justification for certain events in the Mahabharata and which all seem to imply that the law of karma is a mathematically balanced eye for an eye with no consideration given to the motive or intention with which an action is performed. So after reading such stories, the thinking mind is immediately put in a dilemma. How do we reconcile such stories with the teachings of Vedanta that were outlined in the last video and which have been detailed by both Sri Ram Sharma Acharya and Sri Aurobindo, that the law of karma is not a blind tit-for-tat type of mechanical justice? The law of karma is not a crudely exact legal judgment. A scrupulous merchant who has no forgiveness for sin, no matter how small the error committed, who holds austerely to an eternal Mosaic law, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, a merciless lex talionis, meaning a merciless law of equivalent reaction, where we are forced to incur a precise replica of what we have inflicted. And the answer to this question is that such stories which imply that the law of karma is a blind eye for an eye cannot be reconciled with the truth of Vedanta and therefore must be soundly rejected. In fact, the falsehood of such stories is easily highlighted. For example, in the case of the Gandhari and the insect egg story, there are two glaring inconsistencies which immediately jump out at us. The first great inconsistency is that although this story is supposed to be from the Mahabharata, in reality it is not present in the epic at all. Rather, this tale is most likely a legend, a folklore that has been circulating in certain parts of India and which for some unfortunate reason has gotten incorporated into a recently published popular retelling of the Mahabharata, reading which this particular spiritual bee viewer got confused about the workings of karmic law. In fact, to verify whether this story is actually present in the original multi-volume Sanskrit Mahabharata written by Sage Vyasa, I searched the entire Vilap Parv of the Mahabharata, which contains the lamentations of Queen Gandhari to Lord Krishna after the war. However, I failed to find the story there. What I did find instead was the original but vastly different conversation that took place between Queen Gandhari and Sri Krishna, in which Sri Krishna offered her the true and rational karmic reason why she lost 100 sons. Now we shall discover what this correct reason is towards the end of this video, after we have gathered some information about the sequence of events leading to Lord Krishna's answer. Moving on to the second even greater inconsistency that causes us to reject the Gandhari and the insect egg story, along with its implication that karma is eye for an eye, as utterly false, is that this story is in direct contradiction with the most critical event which took place in the Mahabharata itself. In fact, this contradiction is so severe that it blows out all of Lord Krishna's profound teachings on karma in the Gita. And by overturning these teachings, it invalidates the entire Gita, and from there, as a consequence, it invalidates the Upanishads and the Vedas, and thus overthrows the whole of Vedanta and Hinduism itself. Now, how it does so is most interesting to understand, and so we shall dedicate the majority of this video to deciphering it. But first, I shall set the stage by giving you a little rerun of the events of the Mahabharata so that this contradiction becomes easier to comprehend. So recall that it was in the Mahabharata War that Lord Krishna convinced Arjuna to kill countless people, including Arjuna's own brother Karna and his grandfather Bhishma, who were fighting on behalf of the 100 Kaurava brothers on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. But what caused Sri Krishna, who was God incarnate himself, to recommend such a heinous action to Arjuna? So the reason Lord Krishna convinced Arjuna to kill was because the 100 Kaurava brothers, led by the greedy Duryodhana, had usurped Arjuna and his Pandava brothers' kingdom by deceit. At that time, the 5 Pandava brothers, led by King Yudhishthira, were the overarching rulers of India. Jealous of their immense success and wealth, at first Duryodhana tried to burn the 5 Pandava brothers and their mother, his aunt Kunti, alive in a palace. But when this plan failed, he fraudulently usurped their kingdom in a rigged game of dice. And to further worsen their humiliation, Duryodhana instructed his brother Dushasana to publicly molest the Pandava's wife Draupadi. The Pandavas, despite being mighty warriors of their time, bore these humiliations stoically, mainly for the sake of keeping peace with their extended family, and agreed to their Kaurava cousins' demand that they spend 13 years in exile wandering in the forests. But when this period ended, Duryodhana, still drunk with conceit and power, refused to give back their kingdom. Sri Krishna, who was averse to shedding any blood, tried in vain to broker peace with Duryodhana and his Kaurava brothers. Sri Krishna went so far as to propose that if Duryodhana could not bear to part with the whole kingdom, then he gave the Pandavas just 5 villages to rule and they would be happy with that. But of course Duryodhana refused. When justice was thus not served by the utterly corrupt Duryodhana, who had deceitfully become the de facto ruler of India aided by his father Dhritarashtra, then Sri Krishna saw no option but to go to war. For Sri Krishna knew that if Duryodhana's criminal deeds went unpunished, if Duryodhana could get away with robbing his own cousin brothers of their property and wealth, leaving the Pandavas utterly destitute wandering in the jungle, stripped of all means of earning a livelihood, then what kind of justice or rule of law could an ordinary citizen expect from such a tyrant? If the ruler himself is such a morally debauched criminal that he treats a princess from his own family not as a person with rights but as property to be won or lost in a game of dice, when he treats her as a slave to be exploited and orders her to be molested in front of a court full of ministers, while his brother Dushasana, instead of opposing this vile dictum, actually carried it out with glee, and the spineless ministers seated in the court do nothing to stop this depravity, when the entire ruling class of the Kauravas and their allied kings were degenerated to such an extent, then what fate could an ordinary woman expect in such a kingdom? Therefore, at such a critical juncture in Indian history, when virtue had subsided and immorality prevailed, when justice and righteousness had vanished, and in its place might is right dominated, when the Indian civilization, along with its tremendously empowering treasure of Vedantic knowledge, was facing certain demise under the demonic activities of the ruling Kaurava clan, Then Sri Krishna asked Arjuna to pick up his Gandiva bow and kill his own cousins in the great Mahabharata War. Now, returning back to our Gandhari and the insect egg story, if the law of karma was truly a mercilessly exacting and mathematical eye for an eye, as is implied by this story, with no consideration allocated to the motives and intentions with which an action is done, then it would mean that Arjuna, despite heroically fighting a just and noble war, would nevertheless be condemned to suffer horrendous karmic punishment for killing and overthrowing the immoral Kauravas. Since Arjuna killed countless people in battle, he too would have to suffer a similar violent death in innumerable subsequent lifetimes in order to keep the mathematical equation of the law of karma perfectly balanced. What's more, if this crude interpretation of karma is correct, then it would imply that Lord Krishna, whom we consider to be an avatar and incarnation of God himself, either knowingly gave Arjuna bad advice by asking him to slay his cousins, or worse still, Sri Krishna, the great sage of the Gita, did not understand the workings of the cosmic law of karma himself. Furthermore, if Lord Krishna was not capable of advising Arjuna correctly, then why must we listen to what he had to say in the Gita? And if the Gita, which as Swami Vivekananda has explained, can be looked upon as the last Upanishad because it contains within it the flowers of spiritual truths from all the Upanishads, if the venerated Gita is wrong, then by implication the whole of the Upanishads and the Vedas are also wrong. And therefore the entire Vedanta which is encapsulated in these books is wrong. So you see, we arrive at a most absurd contradiction if we are to take the story of Gandhari and the insect eggs to be true and consequently interpret from it that the law of karma is a mathematically exact eye for an eye. This is not true at all. The insect egg story, along with its conclusion, is completely false. Now, one point I would like to briefly mention here is that the reason why we accept the Vedantic teachings of the Gita, the Upanishads and the Vedas to be true is not because challenging them would mean that we are shaking the very beliefs of Hinduism and we are somehow afraid to do that. Vedanta and consequently Hinduism is not based on beliefs or on unquestionable blind faith in certain doctrines. Rather, the reason why Vedanta holds true is because it is a record of actual experience, of the spiritual realizations concerning the nature of reality that the rishis experienced in the advanced stages of meditative superconsciousness, and more importantly, which we too can experience and verify for ourselves, provided we put in the effort to advance to the same states of higher consciousness. Alright, so moving forward with our discussion, we have seen that the Gandhari and the insect egg's tale cannot be taken to be true because it would mean that either Lord Krishna, the sage of the Gita, did not properly understand the workings of karmic law, or else he knowingly condemned Arjuna to suffer a horrific karmic fate. And both of these positions are utterly false. Instead, the truth is just the opposite. Lord Krishna asking Arjuna to fight the Mahabharata war is in fact the biggest confirmation, the clinching proof that the law of karma is indeed not a blind and mechanical eye for an eye. Rather, it is an intelligently guided principle which takes into account the motive and intention with which an action is performed. As Sri Ram Sharma Acharya has explained in his Hindi book Gehna Karmano Gati, in the Mahabharata war, Lord Krishna convinced Arjuna to kill innumerable people. Rivers of blood flowed and the battlefield was covered with the bodies of the dead. Still, Arjuna suffered no karmic retribution. This is because Arjuna's aim was pure. He wanted to destroy evil and establish the reign of justice and righteousness. So only this pure selfless desire counted because only it was able to leave an impression or samskara on Arjuna's subconscious mind, and consequently his soul kept no account of how many people he had killed in the war. Therefore, whatever be the work we do, what matters most in the court of karma is the intention and motive with which that particular work is performed, whether our motives are pure and unselfish or whether they are self-centered and evil. In fact, if the law of karma was not like this, we would all turn into superficial hypocrites. If only our outer actions counted and our will and intentions were left out, then we would be incentivized to become pretentious, to merely act good on the outside while harboring great enmity and jealousy on the inside. With there being no karmic pressure on us to cleanse our inner nature, our minds of the ego or the sense of I, me, myself, we would steadily devolve to a lower consciousness as the lake of our mind became more and more polluted by the ego-driven qualities of jealousy, selfishness, greed, and evil. And thus the entire purpose of the law of karma, which is to help us attain to higher and higher states of consciousness by gradually wiping away the scum of the ego, so that ultimately we can realize our soul, our infinite divine consciousness in samadhi or moksha, would be defeated. Therefore, the will, feelings, thoughts, and intentions which motivate and drive all our outer actions are critically important and are minutely scrutinized by the soul in determining the appropriate karmic response. For example, when we perform actions with selfish intentions, with the motives of greed and self-centeredness, then because the entire focus of our thoughts and intentions is on I, me, myself, therefore these intentions greatly boost our ego and leave behind their negative imprints, their negative samskaras on our subconscious mind. And it is these ego-boosting negative samskaras which, as we saw in our last video, become the attractors of karmic punishment. But on the other hand, when we perform actions selflessly, when we remove all thoughts and desires of personal gain and self-interest from the equation, when we do things freely for the good and well-being of others, then such actions don't boost our ego because they're not driven by thoughts and motives of self-gain. And so such selfless actions don't leave behind any negative samskaras and consequently invite no karmic punishment. It was precisely for this reason that before the start of the Mahabharata War, Lord Krishna gave Arjuna the profound message of the Gita so that Arjuna could be inspired to perform this kind of selfless, egoless action, also known as Nishkam Karma, on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Nish means without, Kama means desire, and Karma is action. So Nishkam Karma stands for desireless action, meaning actions performed selflessly without any desire for self-gain. Because if we recall, just before the start of the Mahabharata War, Arjuna's courage suddenly started to fail as he saw positioned on one side his Pandava brothers with their sons and their armies, while on the opposing side were arrayed the vast armies of his Kaurava cousins, aided by the mighty warriors such as his paternal grandfather Bhishma and his teacher Dronacharya, as well as many other friends and relatives who for one reason or another had aligned themselves with the Kauravas. Standing in the midst of the two armies, Arjuna was struck by the immense scale of the tragedy that was about to unfold. He realized that in this fratricidal war between two factions of his own family, there would be no winners. Regardless of whether the Pandavas or the Kauravas won the war, it would necessitate the killing of vast numbers of his own loved ones on both sides. Overwhelmed by this surging tide of familial affection and submerged by the simultaneous feelings of grief, pity, and desire to protect his clan, Arjuna dropped his Gandiva bow. All thoughts about the good of the nation got effaced from his mind. He forgot the real purpose why he had come to the battlefield and turned to Sri Krishna and said, "How can I be happy killing my own loved ones, O Krishna? What pleasure can be derived from winning such a war?" Thus saying, he began to offer all sorts of excuses to Sri Krishna to walk away from the war. However, as Sri Aurobindo has explained, when the future of the whole country depended on the results of war, it would have been unrighteous to desist from war. Brotherly affection and attachment to family ties could not justify the ruin of millions of people. The good of the family had to be submerged in the good of the nation and the good of the world. The enormous wave of immorality, corruption, and tyranny that had been set into motion by the Kauravas and which was threatening to wipe out the entire country had to be stopped. There was no other way. Therefore, God incarnate Sri Krishna stood up to counsel Arjuna, saying to him, "Yield not to unmanliness, O Arjuna, it does not befit thee. Perform your actions, your duty without attachments for the welfare of the world. Give up your attachment to inaction, meaning give up this idea of walking away from the war and set aside any desires for reaping the fruits of your actions, meaning do not fight the war with the purpose of gaining anything out of it for yourself. Engage in battle for the sake of battle, do your duty, making pleasure and pain, victory and defeat the same. Evenness of mind, meaning an unperturbed mind under all conditions of life, is yoga. Then you shall not incur any sin." Thus saying, Sri Krishna, in the midst of the battlefield of Kurukshetra, gave Arjuna the profound Updesha of the Gita, in which he asks Arjuna to overcome his ego by first and foremost getting rid of the narrow sentimental emotions that bound Arjuna to the bodily forms of his uncles, brothers, teachers, and sons. Only by overcoming these ego-driven, self-centered attachments to those he considered as his immediate family could Arjuna engage in an honest battle to protect his larger family of citizens. Otherwise, if he continued to harbor pity and compassion for his immediate family, then he would fight the battle half-heartedly. His selfish concerns to protect his loved ones would prevent him from slaying these very people in the battlefield, and thus the unrighteous Kauravas would win, and the future of the whole country of millions of ordinary citizens whom the Pandavas as warriors and as kings had a duty to protect would be lost. Along with this, the second thing that Sri Krishna asked Arjuna to sacrifice were any ulterior desires and motives to engage in the war for the purposes of gathering wealth, power, prestige, name or fame for himself. Because like sentimental attachments, these desires too stem from his ego, from the selfish concerns and false pride in his own success and bodily well-being. And so Arjuna, being a tremendously brave warrior who exercised great control over his mind, after hearing Lord Krishna's profound Updesha of the Gita, picked up his Gandiva bow and implemented Sri Krishna's gut-wrenching command. As Swami Vivekananda has explained, in the battlefield of Kurukshetra, Arjuna sacrificed his self-interest, his desires and his lower self, meaning his ego, millions of times. Arjuna sacrificed his own happiness and the well-being of his entire family for the good of the nation. He witnessed his son Abhimanyu, his father-in-law Drupada, his guru Dronachar and his cousins die in the war. He himself slayed thousands of warriors, including his brother Karn and his grandfather Bhishma, whom he particularly loved very much. Yet Arjuna committed no sin with any of these killings. This is because he performed his duty as a warrior selflessly by erasing all ego-driven selfish concerns for his and his family's well-being that arose at the expense of the good of the nation. He erased all motives of enhancing his own personal stature, wealth and prosperity. He fought selflessly, sacrificing his all for the welfare of the nation, so that justice and righteousness could once more be established. And so Arjuna's selfless, desireless actions, his nishkam karmas, could not boost his ego, and consequently they left behind no negative samskaras on his mind. Thus Arjuna did not have to bear any karmic punishment for slaying thousands in the battlefield of Kurukshetra. As the great Lord Sri Krishna has himself explained in the Gita, whosoever has his temperament purged from egoism, whosoever suffers not his soul to receive the impress of the deed, though he slay the whole world, yet he slays not and is not bound to reap the karmic results of his action. Alright, so now that we have seen that the law of karma is not a barbaric eye for an eye, but an intelligently guided principle, which as Lord Krishna has explained in the Gita, minutely factors in the thoughts, motives, intentions and feelings which precede and guide all our actions, we can move on to uncovering the real conversation that took place between Queen Gandhari and Lord Krishna, in which Lord Krishna offers her the true karmic reason why she lost her 100 sons in the great Mahabharata War. So in this original exchange, which is found spread out over the Strivila Parv and the early stanzas of the Shraddh Parv in Sage Vyasa's original Sanskrit Mahabharata, Queen Gandhari says to Sri Krishna, "O Krishna, surely I must have committed some terrible sins in my past lives, because of which I am having to see my sons, grandsons and brothers lying dead in the battlefield." Saying so, the distraught queen began to lament before Sri Krishna and eventually started blaming him for not doing more to stop the war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. The Lord patiently heard Gandhari out and then replied, "O Gandhari, get up. Do not drown in sorrow. It is because of your own misdeeds that the Kauravas perished. Your son Duryodhana was a wicked person who was jealous and extremely conceited. He was the epitome of evil actions, selfishness and envy, and he never listened to the advice of his elders and well-wishers. As a parent, you failed in your responsibility to properly guide your son, and therefore now you have to bear the bitter fruits of your own actions. Then how can you blame me, O Gandhari?" Listening to this harsh truth spoken by Sri Krishna, Gandhari became silent. So this is the actual conversation. Notice that in this exchange, Sri Krishna does not tell Gandhari some silly half-witted tale that she killed the eggs of an insect in a past life, but he tells her the straightforward logical truth that Gandhari was reaping the karmic results of her own failings as a parent to properly guide and discipline her eldest son Duryodhana, whose evil influence spread to all her other children including Dushasana. Furthermore, in witnessing the death of her sons, Gandhari was not reaping the effects of any past life karma, but of those actions which she had performed in that very life itself. Now, before we end, there are a couple of points I would like to draw your attention to. The first is that in convincing Arjuna to fight and ultimately win the great Mahabharata War, Sri Krishna actually saved India from a terrible fate. And we Indians are reaping the benefits of his actions to this very day. What this fate was and how Sri Krishna saved India, all of this has been wonderfully detailed by Sri Aurobindo in his book Introduction to the Gita. This is a small book of about 100 pages and it contains the essay Sri Aurobindo wrote on this subject. The second is a note of caution that I wanted to sound about reading retellings of our historical spiritual texts such as the Mahabharata. As has been highlighted by this video, the authenticity and accuracy of at least one of our present-day retellings has been compromised by the inclusion of the false Gandhari and the insect egg story. So we need to be very cautious in selecting the right author. The third point I wanted to mention is that although I have referred to Bhishma Pitama as Arjuna's grandfather, in reality he was not Arjuna's direct grandfather. Instead, he was his grandfather's half-brother, but in our Indian tradition, grandfather's brother is also called as grandfather. So for the purpose of this video, I have referred to him as such. The fourth and last point I wanted to highlight is that in this video, I have used the English transliterations of the original Sanskrit words. For example, the Sanskrit word is Mahabharat, which when transliterated into English becomes Mahabharata. Similarly, Arjun transliterated becomes Arjuna, Pandav becomes Pandava, Duryodhan becomes Duryodhana, Sanskar becomes Samskara, and so on. Now, although I would have preferred to use the Sanskrit pronunciations because frankly I am more comfortable with them, I have nevertheless not done so in order to maintain consistency with the writings of the gurus that I have referenced in this and other videos, all of whom use the transliterated words in their English writings. Keeping my pronunciations consistent with their writings would avoid confusing the minds of those who read the books referenced via these videos. Now going forward, our Karma series will continue as there are many more fascinating points to iron out. However, I might intersperse it with some other topics. So while I'm making the next video, here are some golden words of Sri Aurobindo and Sri Ram Sharma Acharya to commit to memory. The law of karma is not mathematical or mechanical. Karma is a machinery to help the consciousness grow by experience. Whatever be the work we do, what matters most in the court of karma is the intention and the motive with which that particular work is performed. Goodbye, and I shall see you in the next video.